Please wait your turn, they said. The 78-year-old retired major quietly joined the line, his old uniform bearing metal badges that caught the fluorescent light. A young customer smirked. Why do these old guys still wear these things? They laughed, but 10 minutes later, when the assistant manager saw him, welcome to True Veteran Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of First National Bank in downtown Richmond, Virginia. It was barely 9:30 a.m., but the lobby was already bustling with the usual crowd. Business professionals in sharp suits, young mothers juggling paperwork, and restless children. Elderly customers moving slowly with careful steps. Mahmut Demir stood at the entrance, his weathered hand gripping the heavy glass door. At 78, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had learned long ago that every step mattered. His left leg, more metal than bone now, supported him with the kind of stubborn determination that only came from decades of refusing to quit. He wore his old dress uniform, not because he had to, but because it was Tuesday. Every first Tuesday of the month, he wore it to collect his pension. Not out of pride necessarily, but out of habit, out of memory, out of a promise he'd made to men who never made it home. The uniform was faded now, the fabric soft from too many washings, but every crease was sharp, every button polished. On his chest, 3 ribbons told a story most people had forgotten. Cyprus 1974, a United Nations peacekeeping medal, and a Purple Heart that came with a leg that would never quite work right again. Mahmut approached the customer service desk, his prosthetic leg creating a subtle rhythm against the marble floor. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag reading Jessica, looked up with the practiced smile of someone who dealt with hundreds of faces every day. "Good morning," Mahmut said quietly, his accent still carrying traces of the village where he was born. "I'd like to make a withdrawal from my pension account." Jessica's smile faltered slightly as she noticed his age, his uniform, the way he shifted his weight to favor his good leg. "Sir, you'll need to wait in the general customer line," she said, pointing toward a queue that stretched nearly to the entrance. "Regular transactions are handled over there." Mahmut nodded once, no complaint in his expression. He'd waited in longer lines before, much longer. He made his way to the back of the queue, taking his place behind a young couple who were deep in conversation about their mortgage application. That's when he heard it. "Look at this guy," the young man whispered to his girlfriend, not quite quietly enough, "still wearing his costume like it's Halloween or something." The woman giggled. "Why do these old guys still wear these things? The war's been over for like 50 years. "Probably thinks he's still important," the man replied, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty that comes from never having faced anything more dangerous than a difficult exam. Like wearing those medals is going to get him special treatment. Mahmut's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His fingers found the small photograph in his uniform pocket, a black and white image of 12 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at a camera that captured them just weeks before everything changed. Only 3 of them had come home. Only 1 was still alive. The line moved slowly. Behind Mahmut, the comments continued. "My grandfather was in World War II," a middle-aged woman said to her friend. "At least that was a real war. What did this guy even do? Probably just sat in some office somewhere. These old veterans think they deserve everything handed to them," another voice chimed in. "It's 2024, not 1974. Time to move on." Each word landed like a small stone, building a weight in Mahmut's chest that he'd carried for decades. He'd heard it all before, in grocery stores, at doctor's appointments, in the eyes of people who saw his medals and assumed they understood his story without ever asking what it cost. The truth was, Mahmut had never talked about Cyprus. Not to his late wife, not to his children, not even to himself most days. But on nights when sleep wouldn't come, he remembered the morning when Turkish forces broke through their defensive line. He remembered carrying wounded soldiers through sniper fire, his legs shattered by shrapnel, but still moving because stopping meant dying. He remembered the weight of friends who didn't make it, and the guilt that came with surviving when better men didn't. "Next," Jessica called from her window. Mahmut stepped forward, but as he did, His prosthetic caught slightly on the carpet edge. He stumbled, just for a moment, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the rope barrier. "Careful there, Grandpa," someone said behind him. "Maybe you should have someone drive you next time." Laughter rippled through the line, quiet but unmistakable. Mahmut straightened, his face flushing not from embarrassment, but from a kind of tired sadness that ran deeper than shame. He approached Jessica's window and placed his pension card on the counter. "I'd like to withdraw $200, please," he said simply. Jessica typed something into her computer, her expression neutral but impatient. "I'll need to see additional identification, sir, and there's a $15 fee for assisted withdrawal services." "Assisted withdrawal?" Mahmut asked, confused. "For customers who require extra time or assistance due to age-related limitations," she explained, not meeting his eyes. Behind him, someone sighed loudly. "Come on, this is taking forever," a voice complained. Mahmut reached for his wallet with fingers that had once been steady enough to diffuse explosives, but now trembled slightly from age and medication. As he fumbled with the worn leather, his pension card slipped from the counter and fluttered to the floor. He bent slowly to retrieve it, his bad leg making the movement awkward and painful. Behind him, he heard whispers. "This is ridiculous. Why don't they have a separate line for these people? I'm going to be late for my meeting." As he straightened up, the photograph from his pocket fell out as well, landing face up on the marble floor. The young couple behind him could see it clearly now, 12 soldiers, young and proud, frozen in time. "God, he's really living in the past," the young woman muttered, not bothering to lower her voice anymore. That's when the lobby went completely silent. A voice, calm, but carrying absolute authority, cut through the quiet chatter like a blade. "What did you just say?" Everyone turned. At the entrance to the back offices, a man in a crisp navy suit stood frozen. His face had gone pale, his eyes locked not on the crowd, but on the photograph lying on the floor. His name tag read, David Chen, Assistant Manager, but something in his posture spoke of a different kind of authority altogether. David Chen moved across the lobby with quick, purposeful steps. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached, something in his demeanor commanding attention without demanding it. He stopped directly in front of Mahmut, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. David's eyes moved from the faded uniform to the ribbons on Mahmut's chest, then down to the photograph on the floor. Slowly, respectfully, David knelt and picked up the picture. His hands, Mahmut noticed, were completely steady as he studied the faces of those 12 young soldiers. "Cyprus," David said softly. 1974, 2nd Battalion. Mahmut's eyes widened in surprise. "You know?" David looked up at him, and Mahmut saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition, respect, understanding. "My father," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Lieutenant James Chen. He served under Major Mahmut Demir in the UN peacekeeping mission." He paused, his throat working. "He used to tell me about a Turkish officer who saved half his platoon when the shelling started. An officer who took shrapnel to his leg, pulling wounded soldiers to safety." The lobby had gone completely silent. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. David stood slowly, the photograph still in his hands. "He told me about a man who stayed behind to make sure everyone else got out first. A man who spent 3 days in a field hospital refusing morphine because he said other soldiers needed it more." Mahmut's composure, carefully maintained for decades, began to crack. "Your father, Lieutenant Chen, is he?" "He passed 5 years ago," David said gently. "Cancer. But not a day went by that he didn't talk about the Turkish major who taught him what real courage looked like." David turned to face the crowd, his voice now carrying across the entire lobby. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Mahmut, "is Major Mahmut Demir. In 1974, he was part of a joint peacekeeping force that prevented a massacre in Cyprus. When Turkish and Greek forces clashed, he ran into enemy fire, not once, but 17 times, to evacuate wounded soldiers from both sides." The young couple who had been making jokes shuffled their feet, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. David continued, his voice growing stronger. "He lost his leg, saving a Greek soldier who was bleeding to death in no man's land. The shrapnel that shattered his femur also saved the life of a 19-year-old kid from Athens who grew up to become a doctor and saved hundreds of lives because Major Demir wouldn't let him die in a field. He held up the photograph. 12 men in this picture. 8 of them are alive today because this man carried them to safety. 3 others died in his arms, and he still carries their dog tags in his wallet. The silence in the lobby was profound now. Some people were crying. Others stared at the floor, shame written across their faces. David walked back to Mahmut and carefully placed the photograph in his hands. "Sir," he said, his voice formal but filled with emotion, "it would be my honor to personally handle your banking needs today." But Mahmut shook his head gently. "That's not necessary, son. I just came to get my pension money." "I know," David said, "but my father made me promise something before he died. He said if I ever had the chance to serve the man who brought him home from Cyprus, I should do it with everything I had." David turned to Jessica, his voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "Please escort Major Demir to my office, cancel my 11 o'clock meeting, and make sure he never waits in another line in this bank again." As they walked toward the back offices, the entire lobby rose to their feet. It wasn't planned, wasn't organized. It just happened. One person stood, then another, until every single customer and employee in that bank was standing in respect for a man they'd dismissed moments before. The young couple who had started the cruel comments stood too, tears streaming down their faces. The middle-aged woman who had questioned his service covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Mahmut paused at the threshold of the office hallway and turned back to the crowd. He didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the applause that had begun to fill the space. He simply nodded once, the kind of nod a soldier gives to other soldiers, and disappeared into the back offices. But the story didn't end there. Later that afternoon, David Chen sat in his office, typing carefully on his computer. He wasn't writing a report or updating account files. He was composing an email to the local newspaper, to the Veterans Administration, to anyone who would listen. The subject line read, "A hero walks among us." Within a week, Major Mahmut Demir's story had spread across the internet. Not as a viral meme or a feel-good video, but as something deeper. Veterans organizations reached out, history teachers requested interviews, a documentary filmmaker called from New York. But the most important call came from a number Mahmut didn't recognize. Major Demir? The voice was older, gravelly, speaking English with a slight Greek accent. "This is Dr. Andreas Stavros. I think you saved my life in Cyprus." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. 2 old soldiers, former enemies who had become brothers in the crucible of war, talking across decades and oceans about a moment that had defined both their lives. Dr. Stavros flew to Virginia 2 months later. The reunion at the airport, an elderly Turkish veteran and an elderly Greek doctor embracing while their families wept, made headlines around the world. But the story was far from over. Word spread quickly through Richmond's veteran community about what had happened at First National Bank. Within days, Mahmut found himself receiving phone calls from local news stations, veteran organizations, and most surprisingly, from soldiers he had served with decades ago. The first call came from Colonel James Mitchell, retired, who had served alongside Mahmut during the peacekeeping mission. "Mahmut," his voice cracked over the phone, "I saw the news story. I never forgot what you did for us. None of us did." More calls followed. Sergeant Maria Santos, who had served as a medic and remembered how Mahmut had carried wounded soldiers for miles through hostile territory. Captain Robert King, who owed his life to Mahmut's quick thinking during an ambush that could have wiped out their entire unit. Each conversation brought back memories that Mahmut had buried for decades, not out of shame, but out of a soldier's instinct to focus forward rather than backward. But now, hearing these voices from his past, he began to understand that his story wasn't just his own. It belonged to everyone whose life had been touched by his service. 2 weeks after the bank incident, something extraordinary happened. David Chen received a call at his office from the Pentagon. A general wanted to speak with Major Mahmut Demir about a ceremony being planned in Washington, D.C. "I can't accept any honors," Mahmut told David when he heard about the call. "I was just doing my job." David smiled gently. "Sir, with respect, it's not just about you anymore. There are young soldiers serving right now who need to see that their service matters, that their sacrifices will be remembered. The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at Arlington National Cemetery. Mahmut, wearing his old uniform, now cleaned and pressed by a local tailor who refused to accept payment, stood among a small group of veterans being honored for actions that had gone unrecognized for decades. As the general pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his chest, Mahmut thought about the 12 young soldiers in that faded photograph. 8 of them were still alive, scattered across the globe, living quiet lives in small towns and big cities. 3 had died in his arms, their final words still echoing in his memory. And 1, himself, had spent 50 years carrying their story in silence. But now the silence was broken. The most powerful moment came after the official ceremony ended. A young Army lieutenant approached Mahmut, her uniform crisp, her bearing confident but respectful. "Sir," she said, saluting sharply, "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim. I've been deployed to 3 combat zones in the last 4 years. I wanted you to know that your story has been shared with every soldier in my unit. You've reminded us why we serve." Mahmut returned the salute, his weathered hands steady despite his age. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you honor me, but more importantly, you honor the uniform. Wear it with pride." As she walked away, another soldier approached. Then, another. Soon, Mahmut was surrounded by young men and women in uniform, each one eager to shake the hand of a man who had shown them that heroism isn't about seeking recognition. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching. Later that evening, back in his small apartment in Richmond, Mahmut sat at his kitchen table with the metal case open beside him. He picked up the faded photograph of his 12 brothers in arms and studied their faces one more time. "We did good, boys," he whispered to the picture. "We did what we were supposed to do." He carefully placed the photograph next to his new medal, then reached for his phone. There was one more call he needed to make. "Michael?" he said when the young man answered. "It's Major Demir. How's basic training going?" For the next hour, the old soldier and the new recruit talked about service, sacrifice, and the weight of wearing the uniform. When the conversation ended, Mahmut felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the profound satisfaction of passing the torch to a new generation. 3 months later, First National Bank unveiled a permanent memorial wall in their lobby. It featured photographs and stories of local veterans, with Major Mahmut Demir's story prominently displayed. But more importantly, it included a guest book where people could share their own stories of service, not just military service, but any act of selfless dedication to others. The wall became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Veterans would come to add their stories. Families would bring their children to teach them about sacrifice. Students writing reports on military history would spend hours reading the testimonials. And every first Tuesday of the month, Mahmut would visit the bank to collect his pension. He would stop at the memorial wall, trace his fingers over the names of friends long gone, and remember that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the crucible of service to something greater than themselves. David Chen, promoted to senior vice president after the bank's customer service transformation, would always greet Mahmut personally. Not because he had to, but because he understood that some debts can never be fully repaid, only honored through continued service. The young couple who had mocked Mahmut that first day became regular volunteers at the local Veterans Affairs office. Michael Torres, now Sergeant Torres, would video call Mahmut from his deployment overseas, sharing stories of how the lessons learned from that morning in the bank had shaped his leadership style. And in a small apartment in Athens, Greece, Dr. Andreas Stavros kept a framed photograph on his desk, a picture of himself as a young soldier being carried to safety by a Turkish major whose name he had never known until 50 years later. Beside it sat a letter that arrived every Christmas, written in careful English by the man who had given him the gift of life. The last scene of our story takes place exactly 1 year after that morning in the bank. Mahmut, now 79, walked through the doors of First National wearing his uniform as always. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Lieutenant Sarah Kim, home on leave, wearing her dress blues. Behind them came a small group of local veterans, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all united by the shared understanding of service. They weren't there for banking business. They were there for the memorial wall's first anniversary celebration, a quiet ceremony attended by bank employees, customers, and community members who had all learned something important that year: that heroism doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers its presence through acts of quiet courage, selfless service, and the willingness to carry others when they can no longer carry themselves. As Mahmut stood before the wall, reading the new names and stories that had been added over the past year, he felt the weight of legacy settling on his shoulders. Not the burden of it, but the honor. He understood now that his story, their story, would continue long after he was gone, passed from one generation to the next, like a sacred flame that must never be allowed to die. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, tugged on his uniform sleeve. "Mister," she said in the clear, innocent voice of childhood, "are you a real hero?" Mahmut knelt down slowly, his prosthetic leg making the movement careful but deliberate. He looked into her bright eyes and smiled, the kind of smile that comes from finally understanding something that had taken a lifetime to learn. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "we're all heroes. We just don't all get the chance to prove it. But when that chance comes, the only thing that matters is whether we step forward or step back. And the real heroes? They always step forward, even when they're scared, especially when they're scared." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood something important had just been shared. As she returned to her mother's side, Mahmut stood and looked around the lobby, at the faces of people who had learned to see beyond surface appearances, at the memorial wall that honored the quiet service of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, at the community that had grown around the simple idea that every person's story matters. He thought about that morning a year ago when he had walked into this bank as an invisible old man in a faded uniform. Now he was leaving as something different, not famous, but seen, not celebrated, but honored. Not a hero in the Hollywood sense, but a hero in the way that truly mattered. Someone who had served others when service was needed, who had sacrificed for something greater than himself, and who had finally found his voice to tell a story that needed telling. As he walked toward the exit, the entire lobby rose to their feet, not in orchestrated ceremony, but in spontaneous recognition of a truth that had taken them all too long to see, that heroism walks among us every day, wearing the faces of ordinary people who have chosen to do extraordinary things. Mahmut paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back one last time. His eyes found David Chen, now standing among the crowd with tears on his cheeks. Their eyes met across the lobby, and in that moment, both men understood that they had been part of something larger than either of them, a story of recognition, redemption, and the enduring power of service to connect us all. Then Major Mahmut Demir, hero of Cyprus, guardian of the fallen, and teacher of the living, walked out into the Virginia sunshine, his shadow long behind him, but his legacy stretching infinitely forward. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places, not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone remembered their sacrifice. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to True Veteran Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.